Hi there, and welcome to our bi-weekly digital meeting place. We're about to let someone else in for our first Art Insider episode of the season, none other than Ben Luke. Widely known for his podcast, A Brush With, but also for his writing in the art newspaper, where he is a contributing editor, Ben Luke turned out to be a real art nerd, which made for the most enjoyable conversation. As ever, finding out about each person's unique journey into art is fascinating, not only for us in the art bubble, but also for you out there in your own meanderings in contemporary art. So we talk about his new book, What is Art For? Contemporary Artists on Their Inspirations, Influences and Disciplines, published by Heni, which revisits the A Brush With podcast and presents the interviews with a completely new framing. You'll find out all about them in the episode. But mostly, what I find really fascinating is that this book shows that digital formats respond to different needs than a printed book, that they are complementary. In fact, it is quite interesting as an exercise to move from one to the other. And even if you are a brush with aficionado or aficionada, you can even try to figure out what interviews you would have taken as opposed to the ones that were chosen, and also compare and enjoy the imagery or the illustrations that accompany each interview. We also talk about audiences, so talking about formats. Obviously, they would not exist without you out there listening to podcasts and reading and enjoying books. So we talk about audiences more from the perspective of museum visitors and museum management. And we exchanged about this nagging feeling that I have that audiences are considered by most art spaces as a sort of shapeless blob, a sort of average of all the averages of all possible behaviors. And this word also carries a lot of biases. An attendance of a museum diminishing is interpreted in many ways and can be seen in many aspects. So it is really interesting to talk about these things and also to try and contribute. If museum directors, museum teams are listening to this episode, I think it's really great to open the conversation, but also for you out there who go to exhibitions to reflect upon what you choose to go to, how you visit museums, but also how the information about the exhibitions is delivered to you. And that's a lot of what we focus on in this conversation. So yes, here we are again, existing and spending time together virtually to go back to real life, nourished, because don't forget, we visit exhibitions so that you have to, or so that you experience them vicariously through us. And also so you can read books. You can find Ben Luke's What is Art For, published by Heni, through a link in the description notes if you want to purchase it or have a look at what it's about. This is not an affiliated link, by the way. I don't gain anything from that. And while you're at it, do sign up to the newsletter. As you know, I'm a writer, and by signing up, you will also have access to all my archive of texts on Substack, as well as the Exhibitionistas files. Because each newsletter is in fact a little bouquet of useful links, post-episode reflections, and also an easy way for you to support us through the Substack platform for less than what a beer costs these days. If you don't know Substack, it's also a place where you can find other writers, other creatives you can wander about, and I usually post some links as well to other writers out there or other creatives who are doing interesting stuff. So, I embarrassed myself trying to introduce Ben Luke the way he introduces his artists. I don't think I've ever been more self-conscious in this podcast in my life. But it was thrilling to do it, and it was even more thrilling to inquire about so many things in relation to museums, exhibitions, books, and artists, and the 90s in the UK. So, stick around. Here comes the episode, Enjoy. Hello, this is Exhibitionistas, the podcast where we explore art in all its iridescent nuance and diversity from all angles with different types of episode, providing a variety of pathways into contemporary art. I'm your host, Joanna Pierre-Neves, contemporary art writer and curator. So, welcome to the first Art Insider episode of the season, where I interview fascinating figures of visual arts to talk about their passions and their suggestions also for you to navigate your own experiences with more depth and pleasure. It is my immense honor to welcome to the podcast writer, editor, and broadcaster Ben Luke. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So Ben Luke studied fine art and history at Middlesex University, where his conversations with fellow students and invited artists progressively led him to swap the paintbrush with the pen. So after graduating, he worked for the press office at Tate Gallery, as it was named then, for 8 years, going from press assistant to senior press officer. In 2005, he had acquired such experience with art and artists and such a talent for finding unsuspected entry points into a subject or a body of work that he started writing for several magazines and newspapers, including the Art newspaper, which he works for as contributing editor and podcast host. He also writes for artist monographic publications and is regularly invited to host artist talks in several art spaces and galleries. In 2017, the Art newspaper launched the podcast The Week in Art, and it is in this first episode that we hear Ben Luke's voice for the first time, a voice that could very well win the trophy of the gentlest voice in the podcasting industry. In addition to this, as a host and a writer, Ben Luke has the ability to be precise, verbally playful, and incredibly comforting. The first episode of The Week in Art covers a conference at the National Gallery around Nazi looted pieces and Rachel Whiteread's solo exhibition at Tate Modern then. It was also the first time that we got to listen to Ben Luke's trademark in art podcasting, carefully worded introductions read with what I would characterize as a sort of syncopated composure. Ben Luke has another podcast with, I presume, a wider range of listeners, focusing solely on artist interviews. It's called A Brush With. It is quite established now and was inspired initially by a Q&A interview published in the Art newspaper since 2019, where a number of set questions were asked to different figures of the industry. Ben Luke pitched it as a podcast at the start of the pandemic on the 22nd of May of 2020, an effective pitch for an available audience then. The podcast was officially launched in August 2020 with Michael Armitage and counts prestigious artists across 120 episodes, such as Roni Horn, Ai Weiwei, William Kentridge, Joan Jonas, Kapwani Kiwanga, Jeff Wall, Marlène Dumas, Labeina Hamid, amongst many others. But what brings him here is precisely the book stemming from the podcast A Brush With, titled What is Art For?, out now, so you can purchase it after listening to this episode, and it contains a selection of 25 interviews from the podcast, but much more as well. So Ben, do you want to present the book in your own words?
Thank you very much. I just have to say that is an extraordinarily generous and kind introduction. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So yes, the book is called What is Art For? You can see I'm holding it up so that Joanna can see it
For
now.
those who are watching.
Yeah, and for those of you that are watching. It's a weighty tome, actually, 400 pages. And as you say, 25 artist interviews from the series, A Brush With. And one of the things, of course, about podcasts, and especially the Brush With podcast, for which we don't record video, is that, of course, you can listen to these artists talking about their influences and cultural experiences, which is the kind of key factor of the A Brush With podcast. You know, it's me talking to artists, yes, about their work, but also about their work through the prism of their experiences with culture. And I mean culture in its broadest sense. It's visiting cities as much as it is experiencing particular artworks and so on. And what we do in this book, and it's published by Heni, and it's been a fascinating and an extraordinary process working with them on this, is really try to illustrate those interviews in a way that, of course, you cannot with a podcast. And so I'm very pleased to say there is a very generous amount of imagery in this book. It's wonderful even for me, who conducted these interviews, to read these interviews alongside pictures. And there are these fantastic correspondences between the words and the images you're seeing of artworks, past, present, deep past, absolutely contemporary. It's a fascinating study, I think, in what artists are thinking now, and to see that on the page as visual information as well as reading the artist's words, I think really justifies why we've done this book. And alongside that, I've written in the introduction, which I note that you read very carefully and drew some information from, which explains my background, but also why I'm interested in talking to artists and what my fundamental motivation, I guess, is in wanting to have these long-form conversations. And then also, importantly, 5 short texts on artists that I've called anchors, and that's actually a term which I borrowed from the Tate. Actually, my years at the Tate, even before I left the Tate, they were beginning to talk about certain anchors around which the collection was formed.
Oh, I see.
And
I wondered where they came from. Yeah.
And as
I don't know if you explained that in the text, do you?
No, I didn't. I don't think I did. But I think it's a crucial word. This idea that there are sort of influential anchors from whom spring, or who weight down to continue the image, a kind of discourse around which other artists can participate. And I think that those, in this book, there could have been many more, but the 5 that we chose go from Velázquez through Goya to Manet to Duchamp and to Louise Bourgeois. And those are short texts which draw the kind of connections between the different artists' responses to them, but also try and explain their significance through time as well. So, for instance, of course, somebody like Velázquez, we now think of one of the greatest of all time, but there was a kind of period between his death in 1660 and the 19th century where unless you were in the royal family in Spain or happened to be visiting a kind of noble's palace, you wouldn't have seen his work.
Which happens a lot, of course, to all of us.
Absolutely. Yeah, of course, very much so. So it's just an extraordinary thing to chart influence,
yes,
and to look at influence and how it manifests over time, and how certain figures just reappear, and these anchor texts are very much about that.
I had some trepidation going through the names because I started going down the list and thought, are there not going to be any women in this list? Because very often when I listen to the interviews, it is true that the famous artists of the past and all these artists, most of the artists you're interviewing are in their late 30s, 40s onward. And of course, the artists that were taught at university and that you encounter most often are men. So Absolutely. I'm curious to see, to ask about Louise Bourgeois particularly, was it a name that, in terms of the women, because I presume you had that worry as well. So how did Louise Bourgeois come about? Is it frequent in terms of referencing?
Yes.
And how is she referred to?
I think in the texts that I write about her, I write about that extraordinary span of time that she connects to. So on the one hand, Louise Bourgeois, I think to most people who do know her, might still be seen as a contemporary artist. She died in 2011, I think. But her artistic life spans way back in negotiation with enormously important moments at different points. So she married the art historian Robert Goldwater, and they relocated to the States from Paris. Her background, by the way, in Paris is extraordinary. In this textile, antique dealing, textile manufacturing, extraordinary rich background, which informs so much of her later development. She moves with Robert Goldwater to the States, and then has this extraordinary life in which, yes, as I say, she connects to surrealism, but then through the 60s, she's when she actually has a period where she focuses entirely on psychoanalysis, where she has mental illness, and she deals with her mental illness through a very, very exacting process of psychoanalysis, which deeply informs her work on the one hand, but also means that she doesn't make art for quite a long time. And then she begins making art again in the 60s and produces, I guess, the kind of iconic, and I hate that word, but I genuinely think these are iconic, these works, the iconic sculptural works, deeply sexual, deeply informed by the psychoanalysis, deeply probing her family relationships. Her drawings, by the way, as well as her sculptures, are the most extraordinary things. There is at the Courtauld Gallery in London, as we speak, there is a room of drawings by Louise Bourgeois which are just astonishing,
breathtaking.
Absolutely breathtaking. She's an extraordinary figure from the point of view that she spans decades, and grew into that moment where installation art exploded and was a pioneer of different forms of installations with her cell works, which are sculptural installations which involve different forms of multiple different forms of materiality and contain these incredibly psychoanalytically informed but also sort of psychically active spaces involving sculptural materials, textiles, architecture elements and so on. I think she does come up through the series A Brush With and in the book, and the reason I think she does is because there is a kind of moral guidance that she has for artists. She has.
That's so interesting. What do you mean by that?
I think she is an exemplar of a kind of tenacity that artists respond to. She, there are many ways in which she informs artists on a formal level. But also it's her journey. And I think very often one of the most interesting things about artists and influence is the fact that they are interested in other artists as a formal example, as a way of learning about materials and imagery and so on, but also because of the way they behave through their life and the way that they made their work.
And so what do you think is most inspiring in her tenacity for artists?
Well, I think it's that thing of, if you think about, you mention about male artists versus female artists, you imagine the environment in which she is making work right from the start. It's a male-dominated world, and she is making an entirely individual practice surrounded by an entirely patriarchal system. And so if you are Louise Bourgeois, to have that tenacity to keep making work and make work with the individuality that you make it, and just keep probing yourself through all of this, even when it was deeply unfashionable, when subject matter was anathema in the 60s in New York, minimalism, come on,
Yeah, exactly.
And so,
and
there
so
she
feminine
is.
and so visceral and sexual. I mean, it was absolutely frowned upon.
Yeah. So to make that kind of work, I think, is an exemplar for artists that, you might be able to see a trend there happening in the corner of your eye, but don't be distracted by it. Do your thing, Don't succumb to what happens to be the modish way of making work. Do what you need to do, not what you think people think you should do,
On that note, that leads me to my first question to you, because when I'm invited to, do lectures or for create workshops in fine art universities, I often tell the students that being an artist is not the only possible outcome when you're studying fine art, and you are the perfect example of that. So I'm really curious to know if you're switching from a creative process, like an artistic process, you were painting, to writing and to working in the institutional context. if it was progressive, if it was a sudden epiphany. How did that happen, and how did you feel?
It's a really interesting question, because I think by the time I had come to the end of my degree, I realised I wasn't going to be a painter, apart from anything else. I was a bit disillusioned with the actual process. It was really, really interesting. In my first and second year, I had very stimulating conversations with particular tutors and so on. In my third year, I think my universe of art expanded to a certain degree, but it made me feel that my work was inadequate. And so therefore, I think by the time I'd come to the end of my degree, I very much thought that art history was the way forward. And so therefore, from there, it was just a question of, how do I manifest this interest in art and artists without being a painter. So it wasn't an obvious thing. I didn't sort of step outside of my degree and go, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go and work in a press office or anything like that. But I was clear that I wasn't going to be a practicing artist. But I would say that having been in a studio and having to go into a studio and make art every day, or 4 days a week, or whatever it was when I was on my degree course, really stood me in good stead in trying to understand artists and trying to understand the way that they work and feel when they're in that studio, because it is kind of terrifying. Going into a studio, it can be really inspiring, but it also can be absolutely terrifying.
There are moments.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the interesting things I ask about artist rituals, the subtitle of the book is Contemporary Artists on Their Influences, Inspirations and Disciplines. And one of the key things I think about the conversations I have on the podcast and in the book is that I'm interested in what it's like being an artist. It's why they do what they do. It's a kind of curious life. And
absolutely,
I think to have a bit of access to that during my student days, albeit with the entirely cosseted world that is, studying a degree rather than just being a free person with no job, or whatever, just going into the studio every day. Yeah, okay, so it was slightly softened by the fact that it was done within the context of a degree course, but still, the idea of going into the studio and trying to make work, having that in my past, albeit briefly, I think has helped in terms of understanding artists.
Mm-hmm. And since this is Exhibitionistas, of course, I must ask you about, a foundational experience with art in general and how that came about. And I remember that in the Jenny Savile episode, you mentioned going to Paris with your school and how that expanded your horizons. Definitely. About the vastness of other people creating something else elsewhere. How were you first touched by art? Do you remember? Was it an exhibition? Was it an artwork? Was it early? Was it later? It must have been profound enough for you to decide to go into Fine Art University.
Yeah, definitely. It was really curious, actually. I think that what got me into art was music. And when I was young, I loved pop music, and I was reading popular music magazines in the 1980s when loads of musicians, pop musicians, people in the charts, were from an art background. They'd been to art school,
Absolutely.
And so
but that's a very United Kingdom. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I'm so glad, because I've spoken about this with many British people who are, into art, artists, people who go to exhibitions with me, and I keep telling them, as someone who's not English and who didn't grow up here, it is such a British thing to have Brian Ferry. What's the name of the pulp singer?
Jarvis Cocker.
So many artists or singers, and really important pop figure. I think even Damon Albarn went to art school.
Right. Yeah. So it's
right. Please do go on. Don't lose your.
You're absolutely right. I think this is really key. That you cannot underestimate the influence of art schools on British music and why it's so fantastic.
Yes, I agree.
And, because the ideas are coming from left field, and some of those are being propelled into people's imaginations through popular music. And that, to me, is that is what I mean about my liberation, if you like, into art. It came through music. So, and it's not even the kind of trendy names. It's actually from that sort of generation after Brian Ferry. So Brian Ferry was archly artistic in the sense that he was taught by Richard Hamilton.
Yes,
absolutely. In Newcastle. So you couldn't get a better tutelage. And in fact, wonderfully, I think he collects pop art, But anyway, so the generation after Ferry, the people that were influenced by Brian Ferry are people like Duran Duran and people like that. So I was looking at these early 80s pop stars. I was like 9-10 years old at this stage,
Yeah, we were very young.
Yeah, so reading Smash Hits magazine, and Nick Rhodes from Duran Duran is banging on about Andy Warhol and Jean Cocteau. And, these sort of deeply mysterious figures were people that I then was sent on a journey to look at. And it took me a little while, but I think by the age of 13, I had asked my mum to go to the Tate. And so age 13 or thereabouts, I'm pretty sure it was 1986, I went to the Tate with my mum, and I can remember very, very clearly being deeply inspired and being completely dazzled in a way by two artworks. And one was Autumnal Cannibalism, which is by Salvador Dali, which is one of those Spanish Civil War paintings. And I remember being particularly dazzled by the painting of a knife, the metal on a knife, the sort of kaleidoscopic paint that describes the sheen of the knife. So that was one thing. And then by Andy Warhol's Marilyn Diptych. And those kind of two artists kind of formed for me a kind of route through which to kind of a window, if you like, into the art world. And from there I expanded out in different directions so, if you've got surrealism and pop and those two figures in particular as a kind of grounding, you can imagine how broad you can then, broadly you can expand your horizons. And you're right. And not long after that, there was a trip to Paris. I think when I was 16, I went to Paris. And by that stage, if you imagine, I've got 3 years of becoming very passionate about art by that stage. And I'd seen Andy Warhol's retrospective at the Hayward Gallery. And by this stage, that was in 1989. It was the great, it was the most amazing retrospective, which was at MoMA in 1989. So you imagine 2 years after Warhol's death. And it's Kynaston McShine, the absolutely legendary MoMA curator, Kynaston McShine, the curator of primary structures. That
information. I'm fascinated with the exhibition information about technology and conceptual art. It's he is an incredible curator. Yeah,
he is an amazing curator, and it was his Warhol show which toured from MoMA to the Hayward. I think it also went to the Centre Pompidou and elsewhere. So I saw that exhibition at the Hayward in 1989, and I think I saw it twice. And by that stage, Warhol had become my pop star, if you know what I mean. I had a Frightwig self-portrait poster from that exhibition and a Marilyn poster from that exhibition on my wall, as if they were kind of icons of my, teenage years. So
was it a relationship with Marilyn, or was it a relationship with the way the star, the icon, was treated in terms of image? What attracted you? Because you were a teenager. I'm presuming that Marilyn was. I mean, I remember in our childhoods, she was still an incredibly glowing presence in the pop world, in popular culture. So was it her? What? Because I'm always interested in the part of life that connects you to art, that then brings you back to life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was everything that you just said and more, in the sense that, yes, I can remember, for instance, we were reading biographies of Marilyn, and her death was so fascinating. Of course, that's what Warhol picks up on. That's why he uses that portrait of her. That very straightforward glamour shot of her. Sorry, that's the wrong term. That very straightforward portrait of her. That was a kind of casting image, effectively. And it was the glamour of Marilyn, the glamour of her death, frankly. The fact that she was this intriguing, tragic figure, I think, was absolutely central. And Warhol picked up on that and knew by making these images that he was propelling that tragedy into our lives. It was the kind of celebrity, the kind of allure of something completely opposite to the life of a suburban kid in Kent, in south of London.
Yeah.
That it was something to do with that too, I'm sure. So yes, it was all of those things. But it's important to say also that I did have Warhol as a poster on my wall as well. Him, one of the self-portraits, the Frightwood self-portrait.
Yeah,
so Warhol
absolutely.
was as
the
much
maker
part of that as well.
The image was completely in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember also like reading a serialization of the diaries of Warhol, which came out around the same time in the Sunday Times at that point. And you have to remember that this is during the AIDS crisis. So I can remember reading about Warhol and the glamour of New York in the context of this terrible, terrible situation relating to AIDS. And, so many of the people he knew were dying just before he died. There was this sense in which this most glorious of scenes, that New York scene of the late 70s and early 80s, was somehow being destroyed. And it was, that again, the tragedy of that was somehow weirdly compelling to me. And so it represented something so other in terms of intellectual life, in terms of the idea of this impossibly glamorous city, these terrible events that were happening, that was magnetically attracted to it.
Time for a short break to let you into the Exhibitionista studio. Look around you. There is a computer, a good mic, the software in the computer, which is a sort of virtual space through which you and I meet with a time and space delay. Then there are my books and 2 perfectly round Flintstones. All the magic happens here. I've been talking to a university whose students need placements, and I could use some assistance with production and research, while also mentoring the future professionals of the field. But for that, I have to pay them, and that's where you come in. Do you know how much a membership costs? A mere £25 a year, which means that you pay £2 a month. £25 for a whole year. When you buy a catalogue, that's the average price for one single book with 2 texts. If you become a member of Exhibitionistas through a platform called Substack, you not only get to support Exhibitionistas, but you also receive on average about 18 more texts minimum that I will have written about many, many, many fascinating topics of contemporary art, philosophy of art, and many other subjects. There's a little bonus that I added, which is getting to ask me questions. If you have a question about contemporary art, about the field, about the market, about studies in contemporary art, I'm very, very happy to do the research for you, or to dig into my little well of knowledge and put the information out there for you. I can name you, or you can be anonymous, so you get to put me to work, as long as the questions and the prompts you give me are within my abilities and the research material available to me. Otherwise, you can go to Donor Box in the description notes. If you have £1 to spare, you can just donate one time. It's very, very small amounts. That's what I do with Wikipedia. Once in a while, I put some money in there because I use it almost daily. And I want to reward people who nourish me. Thank you for spending some time with me here in my studio. Thank you for considering this decent proposal. On with the episode. This would be a very long answer, I suppose, to this question, but if you could briefly auscultate the relationship between popular culture and contemporary art now, which is so different from what you're describing. Do you have a sort of a diagnosis of the reason why, and I think we'll talk about that later because you wrote really interestingly about the politics in museums, but do you think that there's a disconnect between art and audiences, perhaps in certain ways, or this fear that people have of contemporary art because of this lack of overlap between popular culture and contemporary art? Or maybe you don't agree with what I'm saying, perhaps.
I think I agree with it and don't agree with it at the same time, if you know what I mean, in the sense that I think there is still a very pronounced engagement between contemporary art and popular culture, in the sense that there are very many artists who are accessing very popular images and making them dynamic in a new way within the field of contemporary art. I'm thinking about like Arthur Jafer.
Arthur Jafer, yeah.
He's the last artist in the book. He's the most recent interview in the book.
And it's funny because he's one of the artists recently about whom I've had conversations around the shocking aspect of the work, because it's so hard to shock us, right? It's so hard to provoke a sort of reaction, and he certainly does.
Yeah. And I think, like, so for instance, last year, AJ produced this work, which I think is called, its title keeps changing. So before I talked to him, it was called Redacted, and it was just that it was written like 5 star symbols. During the interview, he corrects me and says, no, it's called BG. No, it's called Ben Gazzara, who is an actor from 1970 New York. Then he said, I later learned that he's changed the title to BG, and I think it may be Ben Gazzara again now, but I don't know. Anyway, there is this
It will
film.
change probably again after
again.
the episode's release.
But he has made this extraordinary work, which I really hope will be shown in the UK at some point soon, but it's been shown in New York and LA, which is... and I've seen it as a stream, so I haven't seen it in a gallery context, but it is one of the genuinely most shocking artworks I've seen in my life. And I mean that in a good way, because what he does is he takes a form of popular culture, albeit at that stage a kind of experimental form of popular culture, which is Martin Scorsese's film Taxi Driver. And he takes the final scenes from Taxi Driver, in which a figure, Travis Bickle, this white supremacist taxi driver in New York, goes in and shoots a pimp and men visiting sex workers. But he recasts it based on information he had learned that originally the pimp character was supposed to be black, but the black character was written out, and Harvey Keitel plays him instead. So what amazingly AJ does is he recasts it, reshoots it effectively with a black pimp and black people visiting the sex workers, and casts it as a white supremacist repeatedly murdering black people. And it is one of the most genuinely, like, you use that term visceral, and I think that's a term which is one of the best ways to describe what art does when it really hits you. You know, it does. It's like I always say it's like a punch to the solar plexus. It takes the breath out of you. You know, and this does that. This film by Arthur Jafer, and it's just astonishing. And it's repeated 13 times with slightly different iterations each time. And then in the middle of it, there's this gorgeous moment where the pimp starts singing along with Stevie Wonder's wonderful song "As," one of the great soul tunes of all time. Yes, one of my favourite songs. And this sort of delicacy of this man who's about to meet a very brutal death, smoking on a porch, singing along with "As," is kind of like, you know, again, just somehow weirdly shocking. And yeah. So there you go. There's art connecting to popular culture in a way which I think is deep and profound, and which I think I would urge anybody to connect with, and AJ's work more generally also does that, you know. But also, I think, yes, so there is also a disconnect between contemporary art and popular culture in the sense that I think you were sort of suggesting that there was a kind of suspicion around it, you know, within popular circles to a degree. And I think that is a real problem, because I think with contemporary art, more than almost any other art form, there's this idea among certain people that they feel like they're being hoodwinked, that they're not in on the game, that somehow the rules haven't been explained to them, and therefore they're the butt of a joke.
Exactly.
And there's actually a really good line about this from Alan Bennett, the writer. He said that they should have a sign above the National Gallery which says, "You don't have to like everything." You know?
Absolutely. Yes. There's this sense of obligation of enjoying everything, because my theory is that it's presented as a masterpiece, so you feel stupid if you don't get it. And I think it's also the presentation of the artists, the genius, the masterpiece, the muse, you know, all of that patriarchal lingo, I find. But you may have a different view, obviously.
Yeah, there are forms of construction around works of art, whether they be historic works of art or contemporary works of art, which can act as a barrier to audiences. There's no doubt about that. But also, I feel very passionately, and these conversations in this book and on the podcast absolutely attest to that artists are generous. They want to connect to people. It's very rare that you meet an artist who says, "No, I just want to make work for my peers. I'm not interested in connecting to a broader public. I don't care what people think of my work." I can count on the fingers of one finger the number of artists who I think that applies to.
Names.
But I can't remember for certain whether it is the person I'm thinking of. But anyway, I know that basically, there are some, and certainly have been in the past, people who just want to make work for their peers and they don't really care about having a broader connection. But certainly now, in my experience, artists want to connect. They're doing this. If you look at the answers to the question, "What is art for?" that's the title of the book.
So many of the answers.
So many of these answers are about a kind of human connection.
Absolutely.
And
that is true.
And I think, yes, there are all sorts of reasons why people feel that contemporary art or art more generally is not for them. And some of that is in the language which is constructed around it, and in the kind of environmental and architectural structures that are around it too, of course. But I do feel profoundly that in the right circumstances, all forms of art, historic, contemporary, everything, can connect very deeply to all of us. So yeah, that's why we're doing it, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And we dedicate our lives to it, not only the artists, but all of us, right? So, question related to exhibition going. You were talking about the 89 exhibition of Andy Warhol. So I'm presuming you're not going to answer this one, but I'm really curious to know if there's any exhibition that you feel that very deeply that you should have seen, from the turn of the century to the 20th century to now. Is there any exhibition that you really deeply feel that you should have been to?
There are so many. I'm not a scholar of exhibition history, but I'm unofficially, I guess I'm a scholar of exhibition history. I'm constantly, in my research, dazzled by looking at installation shots of these extraordinary exhibitions that happened in the past and wishing I'd been there to see it. Like the first Papers of Surrealism, which was a 1940s exhibition in New York, in which Marcel Duchamp put it's called a mile of string. The amount of string he used is up for debate.
Yeah.
But basically, he put string all the way across the exhibition as a kind of massive installation, completely destroying the opportunity for other artists' work
enjoy
to be seen.
the paintings.
So there's things like that which, gosh, so many of those surrealist exhibitions actually, surrealist object exhibitions, and the great exhibition in London, the International Surrealist Exhibition. I think the show I most, if it has to be one, the show I most wish I'd seen is the 1992 retrospective of Henri Matisse's work in New York at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. 400 works, all the Russian paintings alongside the American collections, and all of the amazing European collections also lent for that show. It's like as close as possible as you could have got to a perfect Matisse show. And so I was in 1992, I was 19, and I couldn't get to New York. There was a version of it that travelled to Paris, but I didn't even see that. But the New York show was the absolutely comprehensive one. It's curated by the great John Elderfield, who's one of the great Museum of Modern Art directors, a great historian of modernism, one of the most incredibly intense researchers and scholars of modern art. And just like, you can go on MoMA's website and look at installation shots and, little tiny black and white images of show, and I'm gasping, that alongside that, it's that show seems to me to like that. I would have exploded if I'd seen that show. Matisse's, push comes to shove, it's pretty much my favorite artist. And he moves me so deeply. His achievement is so extraordinary that I just I think I would that show I would have been in tears most of the way through it, I think.
So in some ways, it's good that you have
Maybe,
to preserve your syncopated composure. So moving on to politics, or maybe political issues reflected in institutions. I was so happy to read a text you wrote for the Art newspaper. Speaking of podcasts as opposed to texts and the reverberation they might have. Of course, this was directed perhaps more to professionals, but the title is so gripping. Are museums guilt-tripping their visitors? ? No, they aren't doing enough. And I would love you to explain what you were responding to, which is a very specific 2024-2025 situation, I think. And also, why do you feel that you can't participate in that complaint?
So the context is that there is this growing swell of views which suggests that visitor numbers to museums are slightly lower to certain museums because they are, and I'm going to put this quote in the heaviest of quote marks, woke. There's this anti-progressive politics agenda which is appearing sort of subtly in various spaces, various forms of article, which is suggesting that the programming at certain museums, and often it's about Tate, but it's all about other places as well. Whitechapel's come into people's crossfire. It's suggesting that the programming, the expanding of canons, the language which is used to describe historic works within contexts of slavery, of colonialism and so on, is guilt-tripping people. My view, very strongly, is that there isn't enough of it,
What was interesting is that you were talking about heritage museums and not contemporary art museums. And I thought that your scope was so precise and so fascinating, because we were talking not only about the present, but also history, very specifically in what is shown in the museum. And I was very happy to see you, make an argument in such clear words that, I think it's worth picking up again, and repeating.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in that article, for instance, I talked about that astonishing show of the Mughal period at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which closed earlier this year. And it was one of the most beautiful shows I've ever seen. Absolutely stunning show. But it was really notable how little of the politics was there and how little of the sort of geopolitical issues which were central to that period. There was hints of it. You saw the connection between Europe and India. And I picked up on something that Shutapa Biswas, the great contemporary British artist who's been a guest on A Brush With, pointed out, which was a really fascinating article in which, it's exploring how museums in a way are disguising to a certain degree by presenting these really opulent and wonderful shows, by using opulence as the kind of driving force of a show. They're kind of disguising the kind of very real global situation in that period, which is, to me, endlessly fascinating.
Yes, of
and
course.
Wouldn't at all reduce the impact of those works of art. It's not guilt-tripping people to tell them about the situation relating to empires in the 17th century and how they connected to India and the, East India Company and so on, and how it was active and the ways in which colonialism was manifesting in that period, and before it and after it. So for me, the idea that just by presenting something like that within the context of a political and geopolitical and social situation is somehow going to put visitors off is strange, because it seems to me that it's deepening the context and deepening the understanding. And what are museums for if not for deepening understanding? Yes, they are about showing artworks. Of course they are. That's their fundamental responsibility, and looking after the artworks. But part of that is the interpretation of what these artworks that are in their possession and that they have on loan and so on. And I feel that they could do more to make it. I'm quite surprised when you see displays of paintings by notable figures from the 18th century of aristocrats who clearly benefited from slavery and colonialism and the imperial project. And yet nothing is mentioned about why they can afford to pay Gainsborough the money for this extraordinary portrait. It doesn't make Gainsborough's portrait any less powerful. It makes it more powerful in certain ways.
It shows that art plays a role.
Yes.
In these encounters between very different and very distant cultures, and what role it plays of possession, of fascination, also of othering, weirdly, through possession. I find it also very, very fascinating.
Yeah. But also, can I say that one of the things that I think is really, really important about this is a lot of the people that are writing these things are white. And it's really important that just because a white commentator doesn't like being told about empire means that a black or brown visitor to that exhibition or to that collection is not going to respond to it in a completely different way. And it makes assumptions about audiences at museums as much as it makes assumptions about what showing art is about, you know. And I think actually it's important that we keep talking about this, but also just that we have a perspective on the different ways in which we can communicate about artworks, and that all of them are interesting. And let's make these discussions richer, not shut them down.
Well, fascinating. I'd love to talk about this far more, but I would love to move on to the book, because there's 25 interviews from those 120 episodes of the podcast, which you recorded. So sometimes people are not really aware of how podcasts work. So you prepare the interview deeply, intensely. You do a lot of research. Then you meet the artists, you ask them questions, and then you spend a long time editing the episode. Someone edits it for you, but you have to check the editing, and you have to then absorb what that object has become from that conversation. And then you have 120, and they're in the past. So I'm really interested in knowing how you revisited these episodes. And did you change your perception on them? Did you see something different that you hadn't seen in that, in the heat of the moment of producing the episode? How did that work?
It was really fascinating, actually. So on the one hand, there's sort of certain preconceptions you have about which are the best episodes, and I'm terrible at this because they're all like my children.
Yes, impossible.
So it's really hard to say, and in fact, some of my absolute favourite episodes we aren't representing in the book, because 25 from, as you say, over 100 it's a sample of, and a very in-depth sample of those episodes. But yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, I think it's really important to say that I would say that it's not perfect, but there is a pleasing diversity in the artists that we talk to, in terms of geographically, in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their age. For instance, the nice thing is that there are two Michaels interviewed in the book, Michael Armitage and Michael Craig Martin, and I think there's 5 decades between them. So there's a sense in which we wanted to get a quite broad scope. But then revisiting them also has been such a pleasure as we were editing the text. Rebecca Murill, who is the commissioning editor, and Michaela Parkin, who was the copy editor, we were working together quite closely in the early stages of the book and batting these interviews back and forth in text form. And there was a real delight, actually, in that process. I can remember sending them messages where we go, I love this one, that bit where they talk about X, Y, Z. There were moments which I knew were there, but somehow seeing them written down as text made me think even more deeply about them and remember the references. There's a wonderful bit in the Ragnar Kjartansson interview. Ragnar Kjartansson, the great video artist and installation artist from Iceland, who it's probably the funniest of all the interviews, I'd say. It's the one where I laugh the most, definitely. But there's a wonderful bit where he talks about Mina, the Italian chanteuse and of the 60s, and this amazing song that she sings. And it instantly prompted both Rebecca Marill and Michaela Parkin to go and listen to Mina, and and so, and I love that actually, and I hope that that's what this book and the podcast does, is that people will go and look at these references and listen to these references and read these references and so on. It's certainly done that for me. So many books that I've read have come out of these conversations. So yes, the process of choosing 25 was difficult in some ways because there were so many to choose from, but there were lots of reasons why I think it's a balanced selection. There's painters, there's installation artists, sculptors. There's quite a full gamut of kind of means of making here as well. And I think that's important too. If we're talking about artists and being interested in their studio practices, to have a kind of real range of making is really important too. There's, everybody from Jeremy Deller, who kind of it's not really a studio he works in, and he, corrals people to make work within context and so on, and then you've got somebody like Charlene von Heil, the painter, who just there she is in her studio, by herself, forming this world. She talks about how in the studio she creates these kind of mood boards, basically, which surround her, which prompt new bodies of work. And there's the difference between the very social practice of somebody like Jeremy Deller or Theaster Gates, the great American social practice artist, who's also an amazing ceramicist and sculptor and everything else. To have them, and then somebody like Charlene or Michael Armitage, people using paint, is really thrilling actually. And I think you get that from the imagery in the book and the way that they're thinking as well, so very, very different ways of being artists, but also sort of obviously lovely correspondences between the individual interviews as well.
I'm also fascinated by the difference of answers to that important question that gives the book its title, what is artful? And I would love to know if that variety and the difference in answers has had a sort of impact on you, or how do you account for the diversity of answers in this question that sometimes when you're talking to someone who doesn't, and you say that you work in contemporary arts, they ask you, what is it? I don't know anything about it. What does it, what function does it have? What can it bring me? And you ask the question, which I think is really, really courageous for a book title, because then you have to deliver. But the artists do. So you leave it in the artist's hands. And the sort of myriad of answers that you have, how do you handle that, and what does it tell you?
It's a really good point actually, that it's in a way a tricky question to ask of an artist, because it basically says to them, like, why are you doing what you're doing? But that is a kind of fundamental.
I did think of that.
Yeah, but it is also sort of fundamental to the book and to the whole query of the A Brush With podcast. Because I think it is a curious life to be an artist, and I think, therefore, to ask what is art for, what is this thing that we're all so obsessed with doing in the world? It is a sort of a complex question. The range of answers is really pleasing actually. There's quite a gamut. You get like people that use single words, like Sarah Z says it's for sustenance. That's it. And I think she means in so many multiple ways. A lot of artists feel that art is basically a way of surviving in the world. I think, Charlene von Heil says, and I'm sorry to use a swear word here, but she says we'd be totally fucked without it. She said, it's if it wasn't for art, how on earth would we navigate what's going on? Because it's grim, it frankly is so grim out there, and never more than it feels like than now, and so lots of the responses are about finding a way to be human and trying to articulate what it is to be human, and then for Theaster Gates, I think he says it's about healing.
Yes, he does. I was going to ask you about that, because I feel that there's it wouldn't have been something that you would have allowed yourself to say 50 years back or even more. And now it is a recurring word for artists and even for curators, this idea of care and healing. that is quite surprising and frankly comforting.
No, I agree with you. Yeah, and actually, one of my favourite interviews in the book. They're all my favourites. Who am I kidding? One of my favourite interviews is with Alberta Whittle, the Scotland-based, Glasgow-based, Barbadian British artist, who talks about, in the answer to What is Art For, talks about art as a manifestation of hope, but she also talks a lot through the interview, because it's crucial to her practice, about care, about collective care, and art being a kind of an agent within that. And that's I think you're right that the idea of art connecting to care, connecting to healing, connecting to ideas of well-being and so on, to discuss that 50 years ago or whatever would have been anathema. But also, even now, I think, to do it and to understand that that's within a context of criticality, of inquiry, of interrogation, is crucial. It's not airy-fairy woo-woo. It is absolutely about a critical inquiry into the world and legacies of slavery, colonialism, etc., particularly in the work of Alberta Whittle. So it's about those legacies and the damage and the trauma and so on, and about manifesting hope from now into the future. So the idea that it was anathema 50 years ago is probably linked to the idea that you had, the language of art had to be tough in a certain way, but you can still be tough and critical and laceratingly focused on dismantling systems of oppression and so on, and talk about care and healing and so on. So I think that's really crucial.
Interesting. They're not incompatible. Yeah.
No, absolutely.
That's never thought of that, but you're so right. I have a really, really strange question to ask you, as someone who hasn't grown up here, and who, I guess my FOMO would have been the time where artists were being talked about in the press in the UK in the 90s, and that wonderful 80s, 90s, and that wonderful interview is Painting Dead with Tracy Emin and Norman Rosenthal and David Sylvester and all of those people. And I was wondering, what do you make of that era? As someone who was here, who went through it, who was affected by it, who has known and interviewed a lot of those artists directly, embodying that phenomenon, and also that seems so far away now, so distant, and yet it wasn't that long ago. What do you make of that period?
It's a really crucial period, because I was at university in that period. So in 1992 to 1995, I was at university. I was an art student. And so I saw, in a way, even though I was remote from it, I wasn't in the art world at all in that period, I saw, in a way, that burgeoning scene. And I was able to, I'm lucky in that I saw the very first Young British Artists show at the Saatchi Gallery, the late lamented, wonderful Saatchi Gallery in Boundary Road. That, anybody who went there, you talk to them about that space, and they talk about it as the most beautiful art space they've ever seen. It was just an utterly stunning art space. It's difficult to express how beautiful it was, especially within a context in which, London didn't have Tate Modern. The modern collection of that Tate had was shown in what is now Tate Britain, in one side of it. So we didn't have Tate Modern, but we had this gleaming space up in North London. Difficult to get to, a real schlep, but there it was. And I saw that first Young British Artist show, and it has to be said, it's really important to say this, that there were lots of kind of artists that were featured in these shows that have been forgotten. So everybody thinks it's just about the so-called YBAs now, the Young British Artists now, but there were loads of artists peripheral to it that also got shown in these exhibitions that, we've all forgotten about. Alex Landrum was in the first Young British Artist show, for instance, a painter with sort of texts in the middle of the canvases. And then, but in that show was Rachel White-Read and Damien Hirst. And so Hirst showed his Shark, he showed 1,000 Years, which is the piece with the flies and the fly killer and, cow's head. But Rachel showed Ghost, which was the work that connected to me on that visceral level that we were talking about earlier on. And also, I should also say that for me, one of the most profound art experiences of my entire life was seeing Rachel White-Read's house in East London in 1993.
Another one of my FOMOs.
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
And to talk about, sort of great art experiences, a few experiences I've ever had with art have been greater than Rachel White-Read's house. I was so passionate about it because the debate in public culture in that time, to your point,
so it was in the
era,
public space because it has all the elements of an incredibly intersectional work, because it was in the public space, it was in an area that was raised of a social area, basically, where the houses just disappeared. The landscape, the gentrification was ongoing of the city, and then Rachel White-Read decides to basically cast one of the houses and expose the sort of empty space of the house in as a sculpture. So the house disappears, the empty space remains in the public space, and everyone is in an uproar about it, and the art critics love it, and everyone's talking about it. And Rachel White-Read, I have a question for you, because I've always wondered, I've read about this quite a lot and I'm fascinated by that, but I never really understood how she feels about it, which probably has changed across the years. But I never quite, I always have the sense that she was very hurt by the upheaval and the destruction of the sculpture posteriorly. Oh, and this was commissioned by Art Angel, who was starting to think about public space as a space to show art, which for me, as a young philosopher, then curating student, was such an impressive idea, to just put out there. So there's so many aspects to this story.
That's a really good summary of what happened, and it was even more fraught than even you're suggesting, because I think one of the things that's been forgotten about this now deeply revered sculpture or sculptural project is that there were questions asked about it in Parliament. It was that much. It had that much of an effect on British culture. It was so basically, yes. The whole context for Rachel White-Read in that time was impossible, if you like. She was an extraordinarily ambitious, brilliant sculptor. She was absolutely at the vanguard of that scene in a way that people have slightly forgotten, because they think it's Tracy who's at the vanguard of that scene. But at that time, Tracy was not that well known. And if you like, the two standard bearers for contemporary art in Britain in that time were Damien Hirst and Rachel White-Read. They
Absolutely.
were by far the most sort of talked about, if you like, artists of that time. And, Rachel, in the same year, she was shortlisted for the second time for the Turner Prize. She puts this amazing sculpture, the most extraordinary endeavour to create that thing. So take the shell of a Victorian home in East London off, and preserve, mummify the air within it, is her phrase. I love that phrase. It's so perfect. Mummify the air in a room was the way she described Ghost, which is a single room. She expanded that out into a full house, and this time it's concrete. And so it's this massive public art project. The local councillor is just doing everything he can to denigrate it, and eventually succeeds in having it knocked down. There's debates about what would have happened had it survived, because it was, I think, Art Angel themselves admit that by the time it was knocked down, it already, it was heavily graffitied. It was, it was already showing signs of wear, and it was never intended to be to last forever.
Bore the title of your book. Someone graffitied.
Yes. What
right?
for? Yeah. And wonderfully, there was the kind of subject of the debate was summarised on the side of the sculpture, because somebody wrote "what for," and somebody else wrote "why not."
Why not?
So there you go. I mean, it was just the debate that was happening in British culture at that moment was summarised in graffiti on the actual work. But I mean, and I think from Rachel's perspective, in my conversations with her, and I've been lucky enough to have quite a few conversations with her now, and some of them have addressed House. I think from one perspective, she is enormously proud that she made that sculpture. She knows that it's if you like, a defining work in her career, and she embraces that. But also I think she feels a very great sadness that she was never really able to enjoy it because of the furore. She told me she'd go and sit in her car and look at it and see people engaging with it, but she felt she couldn't actually spend that much time physically with it beyond that because there was just so much clamour and attention around it, you know. But it was, if you cared about art, and if you like me, you were a young person who was emerging into a passion for contemporary art, and seeing this debate happening in public culture, you know, it gave you so much fire in your belly about why you loved this stuff, you know. And, you know, I remember, you know, vividly talking to people, arguing with people about why it was so important and so wonderful. So for me, that work, and Rachel's work generally actually, is enormously important, you know, almost more important than anything else. Yeah.
This has been so enjoyable. Thank you so much. I feel like I could go on forever talking with you and learning. I would just ask you one final question. As an art professional, what would you say, or what have you said, to nudge someone, you know, into going to see contemporary art? Someone who may be a bit intimidated or a bit discouraged by not knowing. What would be the thing to say, you think, to kind of convince or excite people about contemporary art?
I think I would say that it will give you a new sense of yourself and your relation to the world, because it's worth experimenting with it for that reason. You know, even if it's not the first artwork you see, it might be the second, it might be the 10th, it will hit you. I challenge anybody not to find the art that moves them, because it is so diverse, it is so broad-ranging, you know. And I think, you know, a lot of the answers to the question, what is art for, relate to this extraordinary revelatory feeling that art has, and its extraordinary capacity for changing our perspective on the world, or making us think differently, or making us richer somehow as people, and finding a way to process what is around us. And so I would say, if you want your senses sharpened, if you want your intellect deepened, if you want your heart fuller, go and see some art.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And
Thank
you
you
out there, don't forget, go and get this book. It's a wealth of information, and you get that variety that you were talking about, Ben. So it's out there for you. Thank you so much, Ben, for doing this interview. It is, I have to say, quite unsettling to have your voice and to see your face reacting to mine. It's usually just such a soothing experiment to listen to your voice. This was quite quite fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks again for your very kind words. Thank you.
Exhibitionistas is an independent podcast created and hosted by me, Joanna P.R. Neves. We have episodes every 2 weeks, and this season 3, is a bit of a turning point. We have 5 new episode types, from more experimental art travelogues or art stories to conversational formats about solo exhibitions with people who are not part of the industry, because we're all both actors and spectators of art and life. If you're new here, you have a whole catalogue of episodes to enjoy. Discover them at your own pace.